bonus episode of the Rebrand podcast, where today I have the pleasure of speaking with John Hill. John is the Interim General Secretary for the General Board of Church and Society for the United Methodist Church. With an extensive experience in legislative advocacy, education, and engagement, John has been at the forefront of directing the agency's mission in addressing critical social issues and promoting justice, peace, and the integrity of creation. Today, we will delve into the roles of GBCS, the importance of the social principles, and what we can expect in the upcoming General Conference regarding the discussion and adoption of the new revised social principles. John's background in international affairs, policy work, and lobbying on Capitol Hill, and now his significant contributions at Church and Society provide a unique perspective on how faith intersects with social action. I'm excited to bring what John has to say to our Rebrand community, so let's jump into it. John, thanks for being with me today.
Great to be with you, Ben. Good to see you.
So I want to just go ahead and jump right into it. Would you talk about just an overall view? What is the role of the General Board of Church and Society within the UMC?
Sure. So we are an agency of the United Methodist Church. We are, we are amenable to the General Conference, and so we, in the Book of Discipline, have a very clear mission and mandate, which is to sort of provide forthright witness and action on areas of social concern that the General Conference has made statements on, and that is generally in the social principles, which we can talk about, as well as in the Book of Resolutions. Those tend to be longer statements. What we do at Church and Society is try to make sure that the words that General Conference debates at General Conference and adopts don't just sit on a shelf somewhere and gather dust. We live into them as United Methodists, as people of faith, and they provide sort of a guidance for us as we seek to engage in justice issues in our community.
Awesome. So what does that look like? I wonder if you could give us an example of how that looks like played out.
Sure. So, the church says a lot of things about a lot of topics. And so I'll say one of the ways that if you've seen the Book of Resolutions, it's pretty extensive. One of the ways that our board has addressed this is really to focus on 5 key areas. And so that helps us give some shape and priority. And those really are the urgent issues in communities around the world. So those are the areas of climate, immigration and global migration, poverty, peace, and health. And we work on all of those issues through the lens and how they intersect with racial justice. And so that gives us some specifics to work on. And our office, we have an office headquartered here in Washington, D.C., which sits directly across from the U.S. Capitol and the Supreme Court. So there is, in some ways, a sort of federal focus on our work, but we, as an agency of the whole church, equip and work with United Methodists in all different contexts. And we also have an office at the United Nations, to be clear, up in New York. And so on a topic such as, we can just pick an issue around access to affordable, equitable healthcare. What does that look like? Where are there opportunities to sort of advance systemic changes to try and increase that access and affordability for folks through policy changes? That could be at the federal level, that could be at the state level. Expansion of Medicaid at the state level could be an example of that. And so we do direct advocacy with decision makers, with elected officials, as well as equipping United Methodists to do that advocacy. And so we have a team of folks who have different portfolios that work on the advocacy side. We have an organizing team as well. And then our other kind of part of our programming is around education and engagement. And so our hope is that we can, connect with United Methodist, provide them with the background and information they need to take action on issues that are of concern to them.
Yeah. Another example that comes to mind for me, some of our listeners will remember from last season, I talked about my trip to Dubai, where I got to work with you and with the Church and Society team at COP28, the Climate Change Summit. Would you just maybe speak briefly on the work that you were able to do there, and the rest of the delegation were able to be a part of at COP.
Yeah, that's a space we've been in. I mean, so that's another piece that's just so such a just so grateful that we as an organization are accredited in these spaces. And so for us, that's a real privilege to be in these spaces of decision making and conversation. And how can we bring into those spaces voices that might otherwise not be heard in that process? And so our work around the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change over the years has really tried to connect with and bring into that process frontline communities, folks who are working every day in communities that are feeling the impacts of climate change. And so in Dubai, we had a pastor from Louisiana who was there with us, as well as a woman from Zimbabwe who is doing tremendous work. And, those spaces, as you saw, Ben, are they can be very intimidating to navigate. And so part of our job as staff who do this is to make sure that folks kind of understand and can meaningfully engage in that space. Our area of advocacy around climate has really been around international climate finance. We understand that the countries least responsible for the climate crisis are those bearing the brunt, and those countries that are historically the largest emitters do bear a moral responsibility to help assist those countries. And so that's been an active conversation for the last few cycles. And we saw some good progress in Dubai. Really grateful that there's some meaningful movement on providing a mechanism to help those countries.
Yeah, definitely. So it makes me wonder, and you mentioned this earlier, but the task of church and society is to carry out or to make real the statements of the General Conference.
Right.
And so how it would seem to me that might be difficult to figure out the best way to do that, or when are you going beyond what the General Conference has said, or when are you taking action in support of General Conference statements? So in these different areas of work, how do you decide the steps which are most in support of General Conference resolution or statement?
Yeah, I think what you'll see if you follow us online, the statements we put out, the actions that we invite people to take are always rooted in the positions of the United Methodist Church. And so what we find, and I've been here for over 20 years, and we've worked on a lot of issues where there's vast disagreement. As long as we are grounded in the official position of the United Methodist Church, we're on solid ground. And when folks might disagree with us, that's totally appreciate that, but they are also more than likely disagreeing with the official position of the church, which is, again, they're right. The social principles are not church law. They are the effort of the General Conference to speak to the contemporary issues in society that are affecting communities around the world. And they're meant to be sort of a start of dialogue and a prayerful dialogue of faith and action. And so I think, I always invite conversation and different opinions on different issues. I think that we should have spaces in our churches, spaces in society to sort of have those heartfelt, difficult conversations. But for us, when we step out and make statements, and again, only the General Conference can speak for the United Methodist Church, but when we make a statement as the Board of Church and Society, that is always paired with and rooted in the official teaching in the United Methodist Church.
Yeah. So let's take a step down toward the local congregation level. So how can local congregations engage with the social principles, or how can they be a tool for congregations or individuals to live into the justice work that we're called to do?
Yeah, I think that's a great question and a common sort of challenge of where to get started. We have a couple of resources on our website that help folks take those first steps. Some of those are We have a couple of toolkits, one for folks who are trying to develop a team within their local church. We have some that are more kind of the how-tos of advocacy. So once you kind of know you want to get engaged, what does it mean to contact your decision maker? How do you hold a prayer vigil, right? So some of the mechanics of all of that. So we have those tools are on our website. I will note that within the current social principles, there is so they are found in our book of discipline. They're also in a separate kind of booklet that is available from Cokesbury. And in that, there's kind of a teaching guide at the end of it. And so what we do when groups come to United Methodist Building, if they're participating in our seminar or doing a sort of social principles familiarization, much of those activities are about just engaging in dialogue. So not meant to say, here is a statement that you have to believe, but here's what the church says. How do you feel about that? How does that apply in your local context? How does this faithfully respond to the concern that's expressed? And so I think that for small groups in local churches, it's a great tool to sort of spark conversation and a safe way to invite folks to share their own feelings and thoughts and beliefs around those issues. And then we have another suite of resources because I know sometimes the statements of the church are maybe a little too long to unpack. We have what are called faith and facts cards, which look at a variety of issues kind of through the lens of the Wesleyan Quadrilateral. And so we have sort of what does Scripture say? What does our faith tradition say? What's the current reality? And then how you might take action as individuals or faith communities. And so with those tools, I think, a lot of churches use them as kind of sparks to the conversation and see what because in too many churches, we don't talk about the issues that are affecting us in our lives outside of the church, right? And in some really difficult issues, there is a dangerous silence within the church. And so I think to the extent that this can sort of crack open some of those conversations in a healthy and safe way, I think a lot of times folks are surprised how many others are wrestling with those same issues.
Yeah. A focus that we have had in this season of the podcast is at looking at some of the trends or characteristics of the denomination that are alarming to us, where we think we may have gone astray, and then looking at ways to get back to or to a new place of health and thriving ministry. One of the things that we talk about is we are missing a lot of young people in the church. And one of the things that we have heard, and I suppose as a young person in the church, I can probably attest to this as well, is a lot of millennials and certainly Gen Z expect some degree of social justice to be a part of their faith life. They look to the church and they see a social club sometimes that isn't involved in people's lives, that isn't affecting change for the better. Is that something that's present in the way that you think about the work of church and society and engaging with different generations or different demographics of people?
Yeah, I think I feel that, I experience that, and a lot of it depends on context. My local church is dramatically different than my parents' local church, and I've been spending more time down in Florida as they've been needing some support. And when I attend their local church, it's just a different makeup and different kind of posture and relationship to the community. And so I think that for church and society, I will say the folks who tend to reach out to us, the folks who are in our networks, the folks that we have deep relationship with, tend to be the ones who do want to engage. And if anything, are frustrated that others aren't joining them, or frustrated that there's resistance in church leadership. And, I think that we have a long way to, sometimes we know the right thing to do in terms of relinquishing control over some things and letting others lead. I think sometimes in the church we have a hard time living that out. And so
Mm,
I think within, local congregations, letting the youth really define and voice what's important to them and just coming alongside and supporting them and standing alongside. I mean, I think that's just something that's so key to social movement, and so key to addressing some of these really intractable justice issues is, centering the voices of folks who are most impacted, and being in a posture of listening and understanding and not arguing, and then showing up in places where they need, ask, want support in trying to make change. And so I think, the work that we do, we tend to have, I think, a more diverse connection of leaders who are part of our work than maybe the overall denomination, but we have ways to go as well.
sure. Yeah. All right. I want to shift to a discussion on the revised social principles. One of the big events or one of the things that we're all looking out for is the discussion and adoption of the revised social principles. So first, would you just talk about what the revision process looks like in general? So how often is that work happening, and what is the purpose of the revision process?
Sure. So, maybe just to take a step back, and we talked about kind of what the social principles are. We didn't necessarily anchor them in the long legacy of social witness that is our Wesleyan heritage, right? So, from the days of Wesley, speaking into the social issues of the day is very important. 1908 Social Creed was kind of the first attempt by the Methodist Episcopal Church North to put into words these social statements. There's a copy of the 1908 Social Creed here in the building when I walk in each day at the elevator bank. It's both inspiring to think about the foresight that folks had in making statements around a living wage in every industry, abolition of child labor. It was very much focused on economic justice, and a little frustrating that all these years later we're still working on these same issues. But that was sort of the start of these social statements. And then for us, the current social principles were really birthed out of a process of the 1968 Uniting Conference. So when we came together to form the United Methodist Church, they actually they launched a study commission on the social principles that brought back a recommendation to the 1972 General Conference that was adopted.
Mm-hmm.
And in some ways, that is the core of the social principles that we have today. And that's important I'll get to in a minute. But since 1972, every 4 years, the General Conference has been making changes to the social principles, considering revisions, edits, additions. Some of the language we have been fighting over every 4 years since then. And so, but at their core, they were still a reflection of this 1972 document that was born out of a U.S. context and spoke mostly to still a U.S. church, and that began, some of the language was really harder to stretch to apply to the diverse context where United Methodism is today. And so it was in 2012 that the Central Conferences in Europe actually had a petition to General Conference that we begin a process to consider a revision. And so it's really been a 12-year process for us, this revision. The first phase was really a listening posture. And so we had listening sessions in Europe, Africa, the Philippines, the US, ask the same questions, just trying to get a sense of, how the social principles are used in that context, how they might be, more reflective of that context. What would more globally relevant social principles look like? And we kind of just sat back and listened and gathered that information. And we had folks from different contexts in each of those settings to hear from each other. And we reported back to the 2016 General Conference, who asked us to consider revising them. And the focus of the revision is really threefold: to make them more theologically rooted, to make them globally relevant and resonant, so it's to sort of reflect and responsive to the needs in the global context, and then to make them more succinct. General Conference has a way of adding words and not always subtracting words, and so they've grown over time. And in some places, there's some duplication. So that's sort of the threefold focus. And I think what makes this revision different than the regular editing process is, and this was just, I think, a gift and is a gift to the general church, that we were able to assemble writing teams that reflected the worldwide nature of our church, and they were able to start with a fresh page. So they weren't using the old social principles and editing them. They were starting totally new. I mean, informed by our long legacy of social witness and informed by much of the teachings in the current social principles. But when they began writing, they started with a fresh page. And I think, in some ways, the arguments that we've had over the last 40 years, it has been a real gift to be able to turn the page and start new instead of editing the words that we have. And so what we brought to this General Conference, we submitted it in advance of the originally scheduled 2020 General Conference, is a wholesale revision. So it's in some ways a little frustrating because you can't say, well, here's the current language, here's the proposed language. You have to kind of read it in whole because many of the sections have been reworked. But I think it's a real opportunity for the church to affirm both a more global statement, globally reflective statement for this next expression of United Methodism.
How will or how might the adoption of this new revised social principles change the way that you and the agency are able to do your work?
So I think some of the language is just much more, it really bridges across the variety of geographic and spaces where United Methodists are. And these were written, and I'll say I have a soft spot for the current social principles in the sense that they are like this patchwork quilt of words from the 1970s, 80s, 90s, and today, right? Like it's like you can read them and you're like, wow, that sounds very 1980s. And then you read this new one, you're like, wow, that's something that we haven't really thought about before. So I have a soft spot for seeing the layers of that. But what happens in that editing by committee over decades is that some of the language is a little clunky. It is sometimes contradictory or confusing. And so I think that this new language is meant to be a preachable and teachable document. It is much more explicitly theologically grounded. That's very much in the foreground. The statements, the sections are mostly ordered in a way that provide the theological framework at the beginning, provide a sort of explanation of what the challenges are, and then how United Methodists can take action. So I think it will be a much clearer teaching tool for United Methodists as we're inviting them into the work of justice.
And then you've shared that these new revised social principles incorporate a much more global perspective. So how does that show up in these new principles?
Yeah, so it's I can point to certain sections that are clearly responsive to concerns that have been heard, and I would invite your listeners and viewers to read it and just listen for what sounds maybe different from how you would speak out of a U.S. context. And so, and again, the language is meant to sort of bridge across them. So it's not, these will be for the entirety of our United Methodist Church. There's a conversation happening around regionalization and adaptability of different provisions of the discipline. These are meant to be part for the whole church, right? This is not something that will be adaptable based on your region. And so much of the language, without it becoming watered down or vague, is meant to bridge across some dramatically different ministry contexts. And that's how I hope the General Conference understands this and considers it, is that there is some language, and I've had the opportunity to hear from and be in conversation with United Methodists from around the world on this. And there's some folks who are challenged by some of the language. And if that language is changed differently, it would be challenging for other folks. And so that's this kind of tension we live in a church that spans some dramatically different contexts. And I hope that that the General Conference will receive this as our effort and the team's effort to bridge those differences.
Yeah. So it's really in the last 10, 12 years, right, since this process began, that a lot of the hard work has been done to get to where we are now with the draft here for the revised social principles. Do you expect any difficulty or contentious debate on the floor or in committee at General Conference?
So I always expect there to be some challenges and contentious conversations at General Conference. My deep hope and expectation at this General Conference is that the tone will not be as difficult as it's been in the last few General Conferences. And so I think that folks are coming into it, at least, as I talk to folks, coming into it with an expectation and really a belief that this General Conference needs to do better. It needs to be in a true spirit of holy conferencing. I think that there are some changes that are likely to be made in committee, some minor changes, some things that have been brought to our attention since we submitted it in 2019. The world in some ways has changed a lot in the last 5 years. And so questions around war and peace, questions around women's health, questions around media technology and artificial intelligence, things that we weren't even thinking about in 2019. I think some of those we might see some minor adjustments. And for me, I truly respect the work of General Conference and the process of General Conference. And those committee members are so faithful and looking and doing their job. And so I expect in the 3 church and society committees that they'll, work through any of those potential changes. But I also feel, and it's been sort of affirmed in these gatherings across the connection, that there's a real excitement about the revision as a whole, right? Even if there might be some disagreements around some individual provisions. And so I am hopeful that this can be something that the General Conference, moves thoughtfully, but pretty quickly to adopt. And in some ways, you referenced the COP. When we were at the COP, it was such a dramatic and refreshing change that on day one, they had a decision text, right, on this loss and damage fund that they've been fighting for years. And it just changed the whole tenor of that conversation. And so it would be like my dream is the General Conference meets, does its work, and even in the first week might get the revised social principles passed, and sort of find this confidence that, we can do big things as a group. Because the last few General Conferences, I think there's been some skepticism about whether they collectively can find agreement around some of the major issues.
Yeah. I've seen that pessimism around past General Conferences, but I still see a willingness of delegates, of annual conference staff, of our agency staff, that there is still a willingness to hold space for optimism, that we are still dedicated to the work of the denomination. So then, as the revised principles are passed, in whatever form that may be, then the work of implementation and education on the new principles begins. What will that look like for GBCS, and what can that look like at the annual conference level?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one that I think about, but I'm also really focused on General Conference right now.
Sure.
And
Sure.
so we're, and then the other thing, just so that folks understand anything, unless there's a specific, sometimes there's specific implementation timelines and legislation, everything won't, generally things passed at this General Conference won't take effect until 25. And so the time between General Conference and January of 25 will be a time for us of making sure the document is reflective of all, and the publishing house will do this, right? Any changes that were made by the General Conference, and then us sort of reformatting all of our resources that are so grounded in the social principles to reflect the new ones as well. And I mentioned it earlier that this is a much more preachable and teachable document. And so developing preaching and education resources around the different sections. And so, there's a lot of work for us once and when General Conference adopts them.
Yeah. All right. I know you're focused on General Conference, but one more forward-looking question.
Sure.
As we move past General Conference, what is your hope for the way these new principles can guide our denomination? Do you think that the way that we as a denomination act will change based off these new principles?
That's a good question, and I want to be optimistic on that. I think that there is always something exciting about newness, right, and freshness and language that's different. I think that's exciting for those of us who get to work with this every day. I think it's exciting for folks who might be hearing it for the first time. I think that, one of the things, and I just want to read like a quick phrase from the preamble of our social principles that I think is it has served me well since we submitted this as a reminder when I am confronted with, or in conversation with, or maybe even in relationship with in the family, folks who have very different opinions and disagreements, right? And I think the one thing for me, regardless of the conversation on regionalization, like I hope that our church continues to hold space for folks who have different views. And that's not always easy. And, I think that our social systems and social media algorithms just sort of lock us into echo chambers that don't expand our understanding, but just kind of have this complete, confirmation bias. And so this is something in the preamble that I think might be a gift to the church as we think about who we are becoming. And it talks about how, like, since the earliest times, I'll just paraphrase part of it, since the earliest times, right, that we have had disagreements and controversies within the church. And that this is what it says, faithful Christians need to face those disagreements and even despair and not cover differences with false claims of consensus or unanimity. On the contrary, the church needs to embrace conflicts with courage and perseverance as we seek together to discern God's will. With that understanding and commitment, we pledge ourselves to acknowledge and to embrace with courage, trust, and hope those controversies that arise among us, accepting them as evidence that God is not yet finished in sculpting us to be God's people. And there's something, I lean into that every time I'm in a space of deep disagreement and think about the ways in which God is still sculpting me and my understanding. And I think, on the other side of General Conference, with that in mind, I think that is a great way to approach this work of justice, which is a space of, deeply held, sometimes deeply divergent opinions about how to address the injustices we see in communities. And if we enter with that posture of, understanding those disagreements as evidence that God is still sculpting us, I think we'll be a much healthier and more vibrant church.
Yeah. Yeah, you weren't kidding. That'll preach. That's a preachable document.
That is the hope. That's the hope.
Yeah, yeah. Well, so my last question, and I made a commitment at the start of the year that I would ask this question of everyone who I film with or who I interview, and I think you might have just touched on some of it right there with your last with your last response. But I ask everyone in this climate of as we are approaching General Conference in a denomination that is in flux, that is at times splintering and at times growing and evolving, there's a lot of reason for pessimism or for to feel beaten down. But my question is, what now gives you hope for the future of the United Methodist Church?
Well, that's somewhat of an easy question for me because I have the sort of gift and joy of teaching Sunday school every Sunday to a bunch of 4 to 6 year olds who challenge me and teach me and give me hope every Sunday. And if we can get out of the way, they'll do amazing things. And there's just something, I love the work that we do, and we get to work with just amazing folks who are so inspiring and so powerful in their voice and witness. But it is awesome for me every Sunday to just sit on the floor and be in conversation with, young teachers, 4 and 5 year olds who have just instinctual understanding of what it is to love God and love their neighbor. And that gives me hope every week when I need it.
Yeah, that's pretty good. Well, John, thank you for the time. Thanks for agreeing to come on and give us a little background on church and society and on the revised social principles. We had a few of our viewers who asked specifically to hear about the revised social principles coming into General Conference. So, there's buzz around it. People are excited. So
there is, and I will just make maybe a shameless plug that on our website, umcjustice.org, on our homepage, you can find a whole suite of resources around the revised social principles. We have them published in 10 languages. We have sort of a backgrounder on this process, frequently asked questions, so that if your listeners either need to understand it themselves or help explain it to others, those resources will be helpful.